Senior xenobiologist Kethvara had been exploring alien worlds for over 200 years. His species, the Altarians, were known throughout the galaxy as the best planet hunters. They could look at any world and tell you exactly what kind of life could survive there. But as his ship approached the third planet from a small yellow star, something felt very wrong. "Boss, these readings don't make sense," said Velmoth, his young assistant. Velmoth was still learning, but he was good with the scanning equipment. His 4 eyes could watch multiple screens at once, which made him perfect for this job. The air composition keeps changing across different parts of the planet. It's like the whole world can't decide what it wants to be. Kethvara looked at the data floating in front of him. Blue and green swirls covered most of the planet's surface. The colors suggested liquid water, which was promising, but the white patches worried him. Were those permanent ice caps or massive storm systems? And the temperature readings were absolutely crazy. "Look at this," Kethvara pointed to the thermal display. "Some areas are cold enough to freeze liquid water solid. Other areas are hot enough to cook most living things. These extremes shouldn't exist on the same planet, especially not one that shows signs of life." But there were definitely signs of life, lots of them. The bioscanners were going crazy with activity signals, plants, animals, and something else. Something that was building things, sending out radio waves, and leaving metal objects floating. "In orbit around the planet, are you seeing this?" Velmoth's voice cracked with excitement. "There's a whole civilization down there. They're not just alive, they're advanced. They've got cities, technology, even space travel." Kethvara felt a chill run through his elongated body. In all his years of planet hunting, he'd never seen anything like this. A world with environmental conditions that should kill everything, yet somehow supporting not just life, but intelligent life that had built a thriving civilization. Their ship, the contemplation of distant truths, hung in space far from the mysterious planet. They were careful to stay hidden. The rules were clear about contacting primitive civilizations. First you watch, you learn, you understand. Only then do you make contact. "Set up all the monitoring equipment," Kethvara ordered. "I want every scanner we have pointed at that planet. If there's a civilization thriving in conditions that should be impossible, I need to know how they're doing it." Velmoth's fingers danced across the control panels. Soon, dozens of sensors were focused on the planet below. Cameras that could see across all spectrums of light, instruments that could detect the smallest chemical changes in the atmosphere, devices that could listen to radio signals and decode. "Them, sir," Velmoth said quietly. "What if our equipment is broken? These readings suggest the planet should be uninhabitable, but clearly it's not." Kethvara had considered that possibility, but he'd checked and double-checked every instrument. They were all working perfectly, which meant the impossible readings were real. The planet below was somehow both deadly and full of life at the same time. Regions that looked like frozen wastelands sat next to areas bursting with plant growth. The atmospheric composition changed so dramatically from place to place that it was like looking at several different worlds stuck together. "We'll watch and learn," Kethvara decided. "Standard protocol says minimum 6 months of observation before contact, but I have a feeling we're going to need longer than that to understand what we're looking at." As the days passed, the mystery only deepened. The intelligent beings on the planet, who they learned called themselves humans, seemed to be doing impossible things. They lived in all the different climate zones, from the frozen areas to the burning hot regions. They built cities everywhere, as if the deadly environmental conditions didn't bother them at all. Even stranger, the humans seemed to predict the planet's changes. When Kethvara's instruments detected shifting atmospheric patterns that should signal catastrophic environmental collapse, the humans were ready for it. They changed their clothing, modified their buildings, and moved around the planet like they knew exactly what was coming. "They're either the most adaptable species in the galaxy," Kethvara murmured to himself, "or they're completely insane." What the alien observers didn't know was that they had arrived during Earth's late winter. Soon they would witness something that would challenge everything they thought they knew about what makes a planet habitable. They were about to discover that Earth didn't just support life despite its extreme conditions. The extreme conditions were exactly what made Earth's life so incredibly tough and adaptable. The real shock was still coming. These humans didn't just survive their planet's environmental chaos, they loved it. 3 weeks had passed since Kethavara and his team started watching Earth, and nothing was making sense anymore. Every morning when Velmoth checked the overnight readings, he found something new that broke the rules of life as they knew it. "They're moving again," Velmoth announced, his voice filled with confusion. "Millions of them, all heading toward areas where our sensors show dangerous radiation, increases and atmospheric instability." Kethavara rushed to the viewing screens. Sure enough, the humans were doing something that should have triggered every survival instinct they possessed. Instead of seeking shelter from their planet's increasingly harsh conditions, they were actively moving toward the danger. In the northern regions of the planet, massive human settlements were buzzing with activity. People were removing the heavy, protective coverings they'd worn for months. They were opening up their sealed buildings, letting the unstable atmosphere flow inside. Children, the most vulnerable members of any species, were being deliberately exposed to conditions that would require emergency medical treatment on any civilized world. "Look at this biological nightmare," Kethavara said, pointing to a section of what the humans called New York. "Those tree organisms have been completely dead for months. No energy production, no growth, no reproduction. By every law of biology we know, they should be rotting corpses by now." But the trees weren't dead. Over the past few days, they had exploded into the most aggressive display of life Kethavara had ever witnessed. They were covering themselves with elaborate structures in bright colors that served no obvious survival purpose. The energy they were spending should have killed them within hours, yet they kept growing stronger. "The humans are celebrating this catastrophe," Velmoth added, zooming their cameras in for a closer look. "They're gathering under these dying trees. They're bringing their offspring to watch. Some of them are even eating parts of the colorful growths." On the screen, a small human child was running through grass that had grown several inches in just days. The child was making sounds that their translation computers identified as expressions of pure joy. The child's parents watched with what appeared to be happiness, not the terror any rational species should feel when watching their young exposed to rapid environmental changes. "And it's not just the plants," Kethavara continued, switching to a different camera feed. "Look at these flying creatures. Across the planet's surface, billions of small flying animals were moving in coordinated groups. They traveled thousands of miles, crossing entire continents as if following some invisible signal. Most species that attempted such massive movements would lose half their population to exhaustion and predation, but these Earth creatures seem to thrive on the journey. The humans know it's coming," Velmoth realized. "Watch their behavior patterns. They start preparing weeks before these biological explosions happen. They modify their clothing, change their food storage, even alter their work schedules. It's like they can predict when their planet is going to try to kill everything." Kethavara studied the human settlements more carefully. The beings weren't just surviving these environmental disasters. They had built their entire civilization around them. Their architecture was designed to handle massive temperature swings. Their agriculture was planned around the planet's mood swings. Their very culture seemed to revolve around preparing for and celebrating environmental chaos. "Sir, you need to see this," Velmoth called out, his voice tight with disbelief. "I'm picking up human communications about something they call spring cleaning." The translation was rough, but the meaning was clear. Across the northern hemisphere, humans were engaging in synchronized behavior that involved removing winter survival equipment and preparing for increased solar radiation. But they weren't treating it like a dangerous transition that required careful planning. They were excited about it. "They're happy," Kethavara whispered. "These creatures are genuinely happy that their planet is becoming more dangerous." The cameras showed humans opening windows in their homes, letting in air that contained pollen levels that would trigger allergic reactions in most species. They were working in their gardens, deliberately exposing themselves to soil that was exploding with microbial activity. They were planning outdoor activities that would put them in direct contact with the environmental chaos. Most disturbing of all were the human young. Instead of being protected during this dangerous transition, they were encouraged to play outside. Parents were actually pushing their children to spend more time exposed to the unstable conditions. The children loved every minute of it. This isn't adaptation, Kethavara said quietly. This is something else entirely. These humans haven't just learned to survive their planet's environmental extremes. They've developed an emotional attachment to them. Velmoth pulled up communication intercepts from human settlements. The data was overwhelming. Humans, actually, reported feeling sad when environmental conditions stabilized. They looked forward to the next seasonal change. They had developed art, music and literature celebrating the very conditions that would send most galactic civilizations running for emergency shelters. What kind of species evolves to love environmental disasters? Kethavara asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. The answer, as they would soon discover, was the kind of species that could make any planet habitable. Dr. Park Min-ho had been staring at his computer screens for 3 straight days, trying to make sense of the strange signals his radio telescope array was picking up. As Korea's leading expert in searching for extraterrestrial intelligence, he'd spent years listening to space, hoping to find proof that Earth wasn't alone in the universe. But he never expected the proof to be watching him. The electromagnetic signatures were unlike anything in his databases. They were too organized to be natural, too sophisticated to be random interference, and they were coming from somewhere just beyond Jupiter's orbit. After running the data through every analysis program he had, Min-ho reached an impossible conclusion. Someone was out there, studying Earth. It took him another week to figure out how to talk to them. Mathematics seemed like the best starting point. Pi was the same everywhere in the universe. So was the speed of light. He started with simple number sequences, basic physics constants, anything that would prove Earth had intelligent life that understood how the universe worked. When the first response came back 18 hours later, Min-ho nearly fell out of his chair. The message was clear, structured, and definitely not human. After days of back-and-forth communication, they managed to build a basic translation system. That's when the real conversation began, and Min-ho realized just how badly these aliens had misunderstood his planet. "We have been observing your world for several weeks," the message read, translated through their mathematical communication system. "Our readings suggest your planet undergoes catastrophic environmental shifts that should make complex civilization impossible, yet you not only survive, but appear to thrive. How do you accomplish this?" Min-ho sat back in his chair, suddenly understanding the problem. These aliens had been watching Earth during one of its most dramatic transitions. They'd arrived in late winter and witnessed the explosive arrival of spring. To beings from a stable world, it must have looked like a planet going through its death throes. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," Min-ho typed back carefully. "What you're seeing isn't catastrophic, it's normal. We call these changes seasons, and they happen every year." The response took longer this time. "Please clarify. Your planet experiences environmental variations that range from conditions that would freeze most biological processes to temperatures that would denature essential proteins. These occur in regular cycles." Min-ho realized he was about to blow some alien minds. "How do you explain seasons to beings who probably evolved on a planet where the temperature never changed more than a few degrees?" Their world likely orbited its star at the perfect distance, with no axial tilt, experiencing the same mild climate year-round. "Our planet is tilted," he began, trying to keep it simple. "As we orbit our sun, different parts of Earth receive different amounts of sunlight throughout the year. This creates seasonal variations in temperature, precipitation, and daylight hours. All life on Earth has evolved to not just survive these changes, but to depend on them." The alien response was immediate and seemed almost panicked. "You are stating that your planet regularly transitions between ice age conditions and tropical extremes, and your species has adapted to consider this normal?" "Exactly," Min-ho replied. "Would you like me to show you what a full year looks like on Earth?" What happened next took 3 days to prepare. Min-ho gathered satellite footage, time-lapse photography, and climate data from around the globe. He compiled it into a 12-month journey through Earth's seasonal cycle, compressed into a format that would make sense to alien observers. The footage started with winter's grip on the northern hemisphere. Snow-covered landscapes that looked dead and barren stretched for thousands of miles. Humans bundled in heavy clothing moved through cities that seemed locked in permanent ice. Trees stood naked against grey skies, looking like skeletal remains of some great disaster. Then came the transformation. Week by week, the images showed winter's retreat. Ice melted, revealing brown earth underneath. Days grew longer. And then, almost overnight, everything exploded into life. Trees burst into bloom, covering themselves in flowers of every color imaginable. Grass turned green and grew so fast you could almost watch it happening. Animals that had been hiding or sleeping emerged in massive numbers. Summer brought its own drama. The same regions that had been frozen wastelands became lush green paradises. Humans who had been covered in layers of protective clothing now wore almost nothing, deliberately, exposing themselves to intense solar radiation. They engaged in activities that would be considered extreme sports on most worlds, like lying motionless under the burning sun for hours. Autumn was perhaps the most spectacular part. Trees that had been green all summer suddenly transformed into brilliant displays of red, orange, and gold. Then systematically they began to die. Leaves fell like snow, covering the ground in organic matter. Animals began preparing for winter's return, gathering food and finding shelter. The cycle completed with winter's return, bringing the planet full circle to where the footage had started. The alien response, when it finally came, suggested Minho had just caused some kind of existential crisis in space. This is normal? Your species has evolved to not only survive, but psychologically depend on environmental conditions that cycle between uninhabitable extremes. Welcome to Earth, Minho replied. Now you understand why we're so tough. Velmoth couldn't sleep anymore. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw images of humans doing things that violated every principle of survival he'd learned in his 2 centuries of life. The data they'd collected over the past months painted a picture of a species so adapted to environmental extremes that they'd turned survival into an art form. Show me their food preservation methods again, Kethvara requested, settling into his observation chair for another day of trying to understand the impossible. Velmoth pulled up the files they'd compiled on human winter preparation. The list was staggering. Humans had developed over 50 different ways to store food during what they called the dormant season. They froze organic matter at temperatures that would kill most living cells. They removed all moisture from food, creating dried versions that could last for years. They used controlled bacterial infections called fermentation to transform food into completely different substances. Look at this process they call canning, Velmoth said, highlighting a particularly disturbing discovery. They seal food in metal containers and then apply heat intense enough to sterilize everything inside. Most species would consider this a form of chemical warfare, but humans eat this processed matter regularly and seem to enjoy it. But food preservation was just the beginning. The humans had built their entire civilization around preparing for and thriving in conditions that would send most galactic species into emergency evacuation protocols. Pull up their winter recreational activities, Kethvara said grimly. The footage that appeared on their screens defied belief. Humans were deliberately exposing themselves to sub-freezing temperatures while strapping wooden planks to their feet. They hurled themselves down mountainsides at speeds that should result in fatal impacts, but instead of being terrified, they were making sounds that translated as expressions of joy and excitement. Even more disturbing were the humans who cut holes in frozen water and then voluntarily jumped through them. The shock of sudden temperature change should have killed them instantly, but they emerged laughing and invigorated. Some even made this a regular practice, as if near-death experiences were a form of entertainment. Their architectural adaptations are equally extreme, Velmoth continued, switching to thermal imaging of human settlements. Every building is equipped with heating systems that consume enormous amounts of energy just to maintain livable temperatures inside their dwellings. They've essentially created artificial microclimates within their structures. Kethvara studied the energy consumption data. On most civilized worlds, using this much power just to stay warm would be considered catastrophically wasteful. Resources would be depleted within years. But humans had built entire industries around energy production, specifically to support their survival needs during hostile seasons. They don't just survive winter, Kethvara realized. They've weaponized it. Look at these communication intercepts. The translated messages revealed something that shook both aliens to their core. Humans weren't just enduring their planet's seasonal extremes. They had developed deep emotional connections to them. Children wrote poems about snowflakes. Adults planned vacations around experiencing different climate conditions. Entire regions built their economies around seasonal tourism, where humans would travel thousands of miles just to experience more extreme versions of what their home regions offered. "Sir, I'm detecting massive synchronized behavior patterns," Velmoth announced, pointing to real-time feeds from across Earth's northern hemisphere. "They're engaging in something called spring cleaning. Across millions of human dwellings, the same pattern was repeating. Humans were systematically removing all their winter survival equipment. Heavy clothing was being stored away. Heating systems were being shut down. Windows and doors that had been sealed against the cold were being opened to let in the unstable spring atmosphere. But they weren't doing this reluctantly, as any rational species would when forced to reduce their protective measures. They were excited about it. Music played as families worked together to prepare their homes for warmer weather. Children helped carry winter gear to storage areas, chattering happily about upcoming outdoor activities. "They're celebrating the increased danger," Velmoth whispered in disbelief. The aliens watched as humans began planning activities that would expose them to higher levels of solar radiation, increased biological activity in their environment, and atmospheric conditions that changed daily. They called it getting ready for summer, and they looked forward to it. Most shocking were the human young. Instead of being kept in protective environments during these dangerous transitions, children were encouraged to spend more time outside. Parents organized group activities that deliberately exposed their offspring to the seasonal changes. Schools modified their schedules to include more outdoor time during the unstable spring weather. "Look at their psychological data," Kethvara said, pulling up communication intercepts from human medical and research facilities. "They actually become depressed when environmental conditions remain stable for too long. They report feeling energized and happy when seasonal changes occur. They've developed aesthetic appreciation for weather patterns that would trigger planetary evacuation on any civilized world." The evidence was overwhelming. Humans hadn't just adapted to their planet's environmental chaos. They required it for their mental health. Seasonal change wasn't something they endured. It was something they craved. "What kind of species evolves to be psychologically dependent on environmental disasters?" Velmoth asked. The answer: they were. Beginning to understand was the kind of species that could make any world habitable. Kethvara stared at the classification form that had been sitting incomplete on his desk for 4 months. In his 200-year career of cataloguing planets across the galaxy, he'd never encountered a world that refused to fit into any existing category. Every time he thought he'd figured out how to classify Earth, the humans would do something that completely contradicted his conclusions. "The Galactic Confederation has 47 different planetary classifications," he explained to his exhausted team during their morning briefing. "From Class 1 paradise worlds with perfect conditions for any form of life, all the way up to Class 13 Deathworlds that are so hostile they can't support anything more complex than single-celled organisms." Velmoth pulled up Earth's environmental data on the main screen. Based on seasonal temperature variations alone, Earth qualifies as a Class 13 Deathworld. The northern regions experience temperature swings of over 80 degrees throughout their yearly cycle. Most known life forms can't survive variations of more than 20 degrees. But it's also supporting a thriving technological civilization, added Dr. Thexmaran, their geological specialist. Spaceflight, global communication networks, industrial manufacturing, these are all indicators of a Class 2 garden world, suggesting optimal conditions for technological development. The contradiction was driving the team insane. How could the same planet simultaneously qualify as both uninhabitable and perfect for civilization? It was like trying to classify something as both fire and ice at the same time. "The real problem," Kethvara continued, "is that Earth's classification would need to change 4 times per year. During winter, the Northern Hemisphere registers readings consistent with a frozen wasteland unsuitable for complex life. 6 months later, the same regions show biological activity levels that would overwhelm most galactic ecosystems. The team had already submitted 3 preliminary reports to Confederation headquarters. Each one had crashed the automated classification systems. The bureaucratic computers literally couldn't process a world that cycled between extreme environmental hazard and excessive biological productivity on a predictable schedule. "We're not the only ones struggling with this," Velmoth announced, reading from his communication panel. "I'm receiving updates from xenobiological departments across the galaxy. Word about Earth has spread, and everyone's trying to figure out how to categorize it." That's when everything changed. A new message appeared on their communication system, this one from Dr. Park Min-ho, the human scientist they'd been working with to understand Earth's seasonal cycles. "Greetings, friends," the message began. "We've been monitoring your classification difficulties through our ongoing communications. We thought you might find this information helpful. We've identified 17 other worlds in our local stellar region with similar seasonal variation patterns. We've been planning colonization missions to 3 of them. Would you like to observe our settlement procedures?" The message hit the alien team like a physical blow. Not only had humans evolved to thrive on a planet that defied classification, but they were actively seeking out more worlds with similar impossible conditions. They were treating environmental extremes that would destroy most galactic civilizations as desirable features for colonization. "They're planning to spread," Thexmiran whispered. "They're going to take these adaptive abilities to other worlds." The implications were staggering. If humans could successfully colonize planets that the Confederation had written off as uninhabitable, it would revolutionize galactic expansion efforts. Thousands of worlds that had been classified as worthless death worlds might suddenly become prime real estate. 3 weeks later, the real crisis began. Commander Lee Soo-jin's colonization fleet arrived at Kepler 442b, a world the Confederation had surveyed and classified as uninhabitable due to extreme seasonal variations. The planet's climate swung from Arctic conditions to tropical extremes twice per year, with radiation levels that fluctuated beyond safe limits for known life forms. The human colonists treated it like a vacation destination. "They're setting up permanent settlements," Velmoth reported, watching the colonization effort through long-range scanners. "No emergency shelters, no temporary structures. They're building cities designed to handle the seasonal extremes, and they're happy about it." The colonists weren't just surviving on Kepler 442b, they were thriving. Within months, they had established agricultural systems that took advantage of the seasonal variations. They built recreational facilities around the planet's climate extremes. Children played outside during weather conditions that would trigger emergency evacuations on most civilized worlds. Kethavara made a decision that would reshape galactic understanding of planetary habitability. He created an entirely new classification, Class Omega Adaptive Worlds. These were planets so hostile that they forged inhabitants capable of thriving in conditions that would destroy civilizations from more stable environments. Earth became the first and only Class Omega world in the galactic database. But, as human, expansion continued. That wouldn't last long. "Sir," Velmoth announced 6 months later, "I'm receiving reports of successful human colonies on 12 previously uninhabitable worlds. They're transforming death worlds into garden worlds just by living on them." The galaxy's other species watched in bewildered admiration as humans turned impossible worlds into thriving colonies. Environmental conditions that spanned from Arctic wasteland to tropical inferno were dismissed by humans as good weather variety. The final entry in Kethavara's classification report would become legendary throughout the Confederation. Species designation, human. Planet of origin, Class Omega Adaptive World. Warning: these beings consider environmental disasters to be recreational opportunities and have developed psychological dependency on planetary instability. Approach with extreme caution. Recommend mental health screening for any personnel assigned to observation duties. Earth had broken the classification system, but humans had given the galaxy something far more valuable, proof that life could thrive anywhere if it was tough enough.